My name is Rachel. I used to think family meant belonging somewhere, until the day they made it clear I belonged nowhere at all. The will was read in my aunt's living room, the same room where I'd spent countless childhood afternoons pretending to be invisible while the adults talked around me. The lawyer's voice droned on, clinical and detached, as he listed my grandmother's final wishes. My cousin Sarah would receive the jewelry, the emerald ring I'd always admired, the pearl necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother. My brother Michael got the books, shelves upon shelves of first editions and leather-bound classics. My Uncle David inherited the house itself, the Victorian home where 4 generations of our family had lived and loved and fought. And my name, it never came, not once. I sat there in that uncomfortable wingback chair, the same one I'd curled up in as a child reading fairy tales, and felt myself dissolve. They didn't even try to hide their relief. My mother kept her eyes fixed on her lap, studying her hands, like they held the secrets of the universe. My uncle adjusted his watch twice, then checked his phone. Sarah gave me that smile, the one I'd seen 1,000 times before, whenever I brought store-brand cookies to family gatherings or showed up in discount store clothes to holiday dinners. Half pity, half triumph, all condescension. The silence that followed my absence from the will wasn't surprised silence. It was satisfied silence. They had expected this, maybe even orchestrated it. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching, especially if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I stopped listening to the lawyer's voice after that. All I could hear was the quiet chorus of indifference that had been the soundtrack of my life, the whispered comparisons at family dinners, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the careful way they planned gatherings, always checking first if I was really necessary for this event or that celebration. I had never been the golden child. That was Sarah, with her perfect grades and her perfect husband and her perfect little life that fit so neatly into our family's expectations. I wasn't even the silver child. That was Michael, the son who carried the family name and would pass it on to his own perfect children someday. I was the one who left home at 17 because staying felt like suffocating. The one who chose art school over business school, who moved across the country for love instead of staying close for duty, who failed at their version of success and succeeded at my own version of happiness. At least, I thought I had succeeded. Sitting in that room, listening to them divide up my grandmother's life like they were parsing out Halloween candy, I felt like that 17-year-old girl again. The one who wasn't good enough. The one who didn't fit. The one who could be erased from family history with the simple act of omission. My grandmother, Nana, I had called her, though the others used her formal name, Eleanor, had been the one person who never made me feel like an outsider. When I was small, she would save me the corner pieces of her apple pie because she knew I liked the extra crust. She taught me to knit during those long winter afternoons, her patient hands guiding mine through complicated stitches. She was the one who drove 3 hours to see my first art show, when no one else in the family could find the time. But even she, it seemed, had ultimately chosen them over me. I remember staring at the lawyer's papers, thinking how easy it must have been to erase me, how practiced they all were at pretending I wasn't really family, how simple it was to reduce 32 years of shared history to nothing at all. The meeting ended with handshakes and awkward small talk about funeral arrangements. I stayed, in my chair, unable to move, while they filed out around me. Sarah paused at the door, turning back with what she probably thought was kindness. "Rachel, I know this is hard," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But you have to understand, Nana was getting confused toward the end. She probably just forgot about you. Forgot about me. As if I were a grocery list item or a dentist appointment. As if 32 years of granddaughterhood could simply slip someone's mind. That night, I drove back to my apartment in silence. No radio, no phone calls. Just the sound of my own breathing and the whisper of tires on asphalt. I lived in a small studio across town, the kind of place my family would sniff at. Exposed brick walls, plants hanging from the ceiling, artwork covering every available surface. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was the first place that had ever truly felt like home. I sat on my bed, still wearing the black dress I'd chosen for what I'd assumed would be a somber but meaningful family gathering, and I cried. Not the pretty, dignified tears of grief, but the ugly, choking sobs of someone who had just discovered that their entire sense of belonging had been an illusion. For weeks after that, I existed in a strange kind of limbo. My family moved forward with their inheritance plans, Sarah posting photos of herself wearing Nana's jewelry on social media, Michael texting me updates about organizing the book collection, as if I cared. My uncle discussing renovation plans for the house with anyone who would listen. They included me in these updates the way you might include a distant acquaintance in group messages, politely, but without any real expectation of engagement. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped responding to their texts. I deleted myself from the family group chat and blocked their social media accounts. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I would make it easier for them. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that amplifies everything else. Every doubt, every insecurity, every moment of childhood pain I thought I'd moved past. I found myself remembering things I'd buried for years. The way my parents always introduced Sarah as our daughter the lawyer, and Michael as our son the engineer, while I was just Rachel. The family photos where I was somehow always positioned at the edge, easily cropped out if needed. The graduations and achievements that were celebrated with dinner parties for my siblings, but acknowledged with phone calls for me. I had thought distance would protect me from their indifference. I had built a life 2,000 miles away, surrounded myself with friends who valued my art and my humor and my fierce loyalty. I had convinced myself that their opinion of me didn't matter anymore. But sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by paintings they'd never seen and awards they'd never acknowledged, I realized that I'd never actually stopped wanting their approval. I'd just gotten better at pretending I didn't need it. The pretending became harder when my grandmother's things started showing up in my family's lives. Sarah wore the emerald ring to her company's holiday party and posted photos with long captions about family heirlooms and continuing traditions. Michael turned the book collection into a home library and invited friends over to admire his inheritance. My uncle began renovation work on the house, posting progress photos and talking about honoring Eleanor's memory, while he stripped away everything that had made the place feel like her. I wanted to scream at all of them. I wanted to tell them that they were playing with the remnants of a woman they'd barely visited in her final months, a woman who'd died lonely, despite being surrounded by family. I wanted to remind them of all. The phone calls they'd ignored, all the invitations they'd declined, all the times I'd been the only one who bothered to show up. Instead, I threw myself into my work. I painted with an intensity that surprised even me, creating piece after piece that somehow captured the ache of being forgotten. My art had always been personal, but now it became raw, vulnerable in ways that made gallery visitors stop and stare. I had 3 successful shows that winter, sold more pieces than I had in the previous 2 years combined, and received reviews that used words like haunting and profound and unforgettable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had deemed me forgettable was watching me become impossible to ignore, at least in the art world. But they weren't watching, of course. They never had been. It was during this period of painful productivity that I started having the dreams. Always. The same one. I was back in Nana's house, but it was empty except for the 2 of us. She was sitting in her favorite rocking chair, the one by the window that looked out onto her garden, and she was trying to tell me something important. In the dream, I could see her lips moving, could see the urgency in her eyes, but I could never hear her words. I would wake up frustrated, with the lingering sense that I was missing something crucial. The dreams continued for months, growing more vivid and more frequent. Sometimes I would wake up with my hands cramped, as if I'd been writing in my sleep, Sometimes I would find myself reaching for a pen and paper before I was fully conscious, driven by some instinct I couldn't name. I started visiting Nana's grave on Sundays. It felt strange at first. I'd never been much for cemetery visits, had always thought of them as performative grief rather than genuine connection. But sitting beside her headstone, surrounded by the quiet of the memorial garden, I found a peace I hadn't felt since before the will reading. I would bring flowers sometimes, or a new painting to show her, or just myself and whatever thoughts I needed to sort through. It was on one of these Sunday visits that I finally understood what had been nagging at me since the funeral. I was arranging fresh daisies in the small vase beside her stone when I noticed the dates carved beneath her name. Eleanor Margaret Hayes, 1945-2024. Beloved mother and grandmother. The dates were wrong. Not obviously wrong. The year of death was correct, and the year of birth was close enough that most people wouldn't notice. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of birthday cards and anniversary celebrations, that Nana had been born in 1944, not 1945. It was a small mistake, the kind that happens when grieving families rush through funeral arrangements and paperwork. But it bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. I mentioned it to my mother the next time she called, one of her perfunctory check-ins that felt more like obligation than affection. "Oh, that," she said, her voice dismissive. "We noticed that too, but it's not worth the expense to fix. Besides, who really keeps track of these things?" I did. I kept track. I remembered that Nana had been proud of being born in the final months of World War II, had told stories about her father coming home from the Pacific just in time for her first birthday. I remembered the way she would correct people who assumed she was younger than she was, insisting that every year of her life had meaning and deserved acknowledgement. But apparently, according to my family, precision in remembering her life wasn't worth the cost of changing a headstone. That conversation crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. My family's relationship with Nana's memory was as careless as their relationship with her had been in life. They wanted the jewelry and the books and the house, but they didn't want the responsibility of truly honoring who she had been. They wanted the inheritance without the intimacy, the benefit without the burden of actually remembering her as a complete person. I, on the other hand, had been remembering her completely all along. I remembered her love of crossword puzzles and her fear of thunderstorms. I remembered how she hummed while she cooked, and how she always kept butterscotch candies in her purse. I remembered her stories about growing up during the war, her pride in her rose garden, her quiet faith that sustained her through my grandfather's death, and her own declining health. I remembered, too, the way she had looked at me during those final months, not with the polite distance my family showed me, but with recognition, with love, with something that felt like understanding. It was this remembering that finally led me back to her house. My uncle had been renovating for months, but the work was progressing slowly. He lived 3 states away and could only supervise the contractors on weekends, which meant the house sat empty most of the time, caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. I parked across the street one evening in early spring, watching the windows that no longer glowed with Nana's warm lamplight. The garden was overgrown, the roses she'd tended so carefully now wild and reaching toward a sky she could no longer see. I had a key. Nana had given it to me years ago, back when I used to visit regularly, back when she trusted me to water her plants when she traveled to visit her sister in Florida. I'd forgotten I still had it until I was digging through my jewelry box, looking for earrings that might have belonged to her, something small and personal that my family couldn't take away from me. The key felt warm in my palm as I crossed the street and approached the front door. I told myself I was trespassing, that I had no right to be there, that my uncle would be furious if he discovered me. But something stronger than logic was pulling me forward. The same instinct that had been driving my dreams and my Sunday cemetery visits, and my growing certainty that there was something important I was supposed to understand. The house smelled different, not like Nana's lavender sachets and baking bread, but like sawdust and paint fumes and the chemical smell of new carpet adhesive. The contractors had stripped the wallpaper from the hallway, leaving behind patches of different colored paint that showed the history of the house like geological layers. The hardwood floors were covered with protective plastic, and there were paint samples taped to every wall, each one a shade of beige or cream that would have made Nana laugh. She had loved color. Her living room had been decorated in shades of deep red and gold, with throw pillows in jewel tones and artwork that caught and reflected the light from every angle. My uncle was turning it into something that looked like a hotel lobby. Neutral, inoffensive, forgettable. I walked through the room slowly, remembering. Here was the kitchen where she'd taught me to make her famous apple pie, insisting that the secret was in the way you rolled the crust, never overworking the dough. There was the dining room where we'd had countless Sunday dinners, the table always set with her good china even for casual meals because she believed every day was worth celebrating. Upstairs was her bedroom, where she'd let me sleep when thunderstorms scared me as a child, where she'd braided my hair and told me stories about her own grandmother, a woman who had crossed an ocean with nothing but courage and determination. It was in her bedroom that I found it. The contractors had removed most of her furniture, but they'd left the built-in shelves that lined one wall. Nana had used them to display her collection of small treasures, ceramic birds, vintage perfume bottles, photographs in ornate frames. The shelves were empty now, but as I ran my hand along the bottom edge of one of them, I felt something give slightly. A section of wood that wasn't quite flush with the rest. I pressed harder, and a small panel slid back, revealing a hidden compartment I'd never known existed. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with papers, and a note in Nana's handwriting that made my heart stop. "For Rachel," it said, the only one who listened. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside were legal documents, letters, and something that looked like a revised will. Not the one that had been read in my aunt's living room, but something newer, something that bore a date from just 3 months before Nana's death. The cover letter was in her careful script, though I could see where her handwriting had grown shaky toward the end. "My dearest Rachel," it began. "If you're reading this, then you found what I hoped you would find, and I am no longer here to explain myself in person. I need you to know that leaving you out of my will, the one they read to the family, was not abandonment. It was protection." I sank down onto the dusty floor, my legs suddenly unable to support me, and continued reading. I knew they expected to inherit everything. I knew they were counting on it, planning for it, perhaps even spending it before I was gone. But I also knew something they didn't. That you were the only one who visited me not because you wanted something, but because you loved me. You were the only one who asked about my stories, who remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders, who brought me soup when I was sick and didn't post photos of your good deed online. The letter went on to explain what I was slowly beginning to understand. Nana had known exactly what kind of people her other grandchildren had become. She had watched Sarah manipulate situations to her advantage since childhood, had seen Michael's casual cruelty disguised as honesty, had witnessed my uncle's tendency to take whatever he could get without considering the cost to others. She had loved them, but she hadn't trusted them. "I made 2 wills," the letter continued. "The first one, the one they know about, gives them what they expect. But this second will, the real one, establishes you as the legal executor of my estate. Everything they think they've inherited is actually held in trust, and you have the power to decide how it's distributed." My heart hammered against my ribs as the implications sank in. The jewelry, the books, the house, none of it legally belonged to my family yet. I was the gatekeeper, the one who would decide whether they deserved what they'd assumed was already theirs. But there was more. "I've been watching, Rachel. I've been keeping track. Sarah hasn't called me in 6 months, not even when I was in the hospital with pneumonia. Michael visited twice last year, both times to ask if I needed help organizing my finances. Your uncle has been pressuring me for months to sell the house and move into a care facility, not because he's worried about my safety, but because he wants access to the money from the sale. She had documented everything. Phone calls ignored, visits missed, casual cruelties that they thought she hadn't noticed or wouldn't remember. She had kept a careful record of who had truly cared for her and who had simply been waiting for her to die. But you, my darling girl, you came every week. You brought me books from the library because you knew I got bored reading the same ones over and over. You helped me with my garden even though you live in an apartment and don't know the first thing about roses. You listened to my stories even when I repeated them, and you never once made me feel like I was a burden or an obligation. The final paragraph made me cry in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and valued. I'm trusting you with this responsibility because you're the only one who will use it wisely. You have the legal authority to distribute my estate as you see fit, to honor what I actually wanted rather than what they assumed I wanted. But more than that, you have the moral authority. You earned it by loving me when love was all you had to give. Attached to the letter were copies of legal documents that confirmed everything she'd written. The second will was properly witnessed and notarized, filed with the same law firm that had read the first will to my family. There were also detailed instructions for how to contact the lawyer, Mr. Harrison, who had been waiting for me to come forward. I called him the next morning. "Ms. Hayes," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I wondered when you'd find the documents. Your grandmother was very specific about how this was to be handled. She wanted to see how the family would react to the first will before the second one was revealed." "You mean this was all a test?" "In a way, yes. She wanted to give them a chance to show grace and victory, to perhaps reach out to you with kindness even though they believed you'd received nothing. She hoped that receiving their inheritance might make them generous enough to include you in their celebrations, to share what they thought was rightfully theirs." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their failure. "But they didn't, did they?" he continued gently. "No," I whispered. "They didn't." Mr. Harrison explained that I had several options. I could choose to honor the first will, allowing my family to keep what they believed they'd inherited. I could enforce the second will completely, redistributing everything according to Nana's revised wishes. Or I could find some middle ground, making decisions based on what I believed she would have wanted. "There's no rush," he assured me. "Take time to think about it. But there is one thing that can't wait. The estate taxes are due, and several legal documents need to be signed. The family needs to know that you're the executor, regardless of what you decide to do with the inheritance itself." That afternoon, Mr. Harrison called a meeting. He contacted each family member individually, telling them only that there were additional estate matters to discuss and that my presence was required. I arrived at his office early, sitting in the same uncomfortable chair I'd occupied months earlier, but feeling entirely different. This time, I wasn't the forgotten one. I was the one who held all the cards. They filed in looking annoyed and slightly confused. Sarah was checking her phone, clearly irritated at having to leave work for what she probably assumed was a minor paperwork issue. Michael looked impatient, and my uncle kept glancing at his watch. My mother was the last to arrive, offering me a surprise smile that didn't quite hide her puzzlement at seeing me there. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Harrison began. "I know this is unusual, but there are some aspects of Mrs. Hayes' estate that weren't covered in our previous meeting." Sarah sighed audibly. "What kind of aspects? I thought everything was settled." "Well, that's what we need to discuss." "Mr." Harrison pulled out a folder thick with documents. "It seems Eleanor prepared more than one will." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My uncle leaned forward, suddenly alert. "What do you mean, more than one will?" "I mean that the will we read several months ago was not her final testament." She prepared a second will, more recent and more comprehensive, that supersedes the first one. That's impossible, Sarah said, her voice rising. She was getting confused toward the end. She probably didn't understand what she was signing. On the contrary, Mr. Harrison replied calmly. She was quite clear about her intentions. In fact, she left detailed notes explaining her reasoning. But the most important change is this. She named a legal executor for her estate. 4 pairs of eyes turned to look at him expectantly. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. The legal executor of Eleanor Hayes' estate, he continued, is her granddaughter, Rachel. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched their faces change as the implications sank in. Sarah's mouth fell open. Michael blinked rapidly as if trying to clear his vision. My uncle started to speak, then stopped, then started again. Rachel? My mother finally whispered, but she wasn't even mentioned in the will. She wasn't mentioned in the first will, Mr. Harrison corrected, but she's the central figure in the second one. Everything you believed you inherited is actually held in trust, and Rachel has the legal authority to determine how it's distributed. The explosion came from my uncle. This is ridiculous. She hasn't been part of this family for years. She doesn't even live here anymore. Actually, Mr. Harrison said, consulting his notes, according to Eleanor's documentation, Rachel was the most consistent presence in her life during her final years. She has detailed records of visits, phone calls, and assistance provided. Visits? Sarah's voice was shrill now. What visits? We didn't know about any visits. For the first time since the meeting began, I spoke. That's because you never asked. My voice was quiet, steady, nothing like the trembling mess I'd been months earlier. You never asked how she was doing, what she needed, or who was taking care of her. You just assumed someone else was handling it. But we had busy lives, Michael protested. We had jobs, responsibilities. So did I interrupted. But I made time. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. If I may continue, there are several legal documents that need to be signed and estate taxes that need to be filed. As the executor, Rachel will need to handle these matters, but she'll also need to make decisions about the distribution of assets. What kind of decisions? My uncle demanded. Whether to honor the original will, distribute assets according to the revised will, or create her own plan based on what she believes Eleanor would have wanted. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Protests, arguments, demands for explanations. Through it all, I sat quietly, remembering Nana's words about the power of silence. Sometimes the loudest response is no response at all. Finally, Sarah turned to me directly. Rachel, you have to understand. We've already made plans. I've had the jewelry appraised for insurance. Michael has cataloged all the books. Uncle David has contractors working on the house. You can't just take all of that away. I'm not taking anything away, I said calmly. I'm simply doing what Nana asked me to do, making sure her wishes are honored. But what are her wishes? My mother asked. And for the first time, she sounded genuinely curious rather than defensive. I looked around the room at these people who had shaped my life in ways both positive and painful. They were my family, despite everything. They were flawed and selfish and capable of casual cruelty, but they were also the people who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and celebrated my small victories even when they didn't understand my dreams. Her wishes, I said finally, were for her family to love each other the way she loved all of us, completely, without conditions, without keeping score. The meeting ended with more questions than answers. Mr. Harrison gave them his card and told them to contact him if they had concerns about the legal process. He reminded them that I would need time to review all the documents and make decisions, and that nothing would be finalized quickly. As they filed out, each of them approached me. My uncle was blustery, trying to convince me that he'd only wanted what was best for Nana. Michael was apologetic, suddenly remembering all the times I'd invited him to visit my art shows and he'd been too busy. Sarah was calculating, already trying to figure out how to manipulate this new situation to her advantage. My mother was the last to leave. She stood beside my chair for a long moment, looking older than I'd ever seen her look. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry we made you feel like you didn't matter. You've always mattered, Rachel. I don't know how to show it sometimes. It wasn't everything I needed to hear, but it was a beginning." Over the following weeks, they called me. All of them, repeatedly. Suddenly, I was invited to family dinners. Sarah wanted to grab coffee and catch up. Michael sent me articles about artists he thought I'd find interesting. My uncle offered to help me find a bigger apartment, closer to the family. The attention felt strange after so many years of indifference. Part of me wanted to be petty, to make them grovel, to use my newfound power to hurt them the way they'd hurt me. But every time I was tempted toward cruelty, I remembered Nana's letter and her faith in my ability to do the right thing. I took my time making decisions. I hired my own attorney to make sure I understood all the legal implications. I spent hours in Nana's house, now officially under my care, trying to understand what she would have truly wanted. In the end, I chose something that surprised everyone, including myself. I kept the house. Not to live in, but to preserve, exactly as Nana had left it, with her colors and her personality and her love of beauty intact. I turned it into a small community art center, a place where local artists could display their work and teach classes to children who might not otherwise have access to art education. I named it the Eleanor Hayes Creative Center, and I made sure her stories were told along with the art. The jewelry went to Sarah, but with conditions. She had to visit the center once a month, to volunteer with the children's programs, and to help preserve Nana's memory in a meaningful way. If she failed to fulfill that commitment, the jewelry would be donated to a museum. Michael got the books, but they became the foundation for a lending library at the center. He agreed to organize and maintain the collection, to read to children during story hours, and to help expand the library with new donations. My uncle kept a financial stake in the property, but only as long as he contributed to its maintenance and operation. His business skills were actually useful for managing the center's budget and operations. My mother became the center's first official docent, sharing Nana's stories with visitors and helping to organize community events. And me? I finally had a place where my art belonged, where my vision was valued, where I could honor both my own dreams and my grandmother's memory. The first time they all came together at the center, for the opening day celebration, I watched them interact with the space Nana and I had created together. Sarah was helping a little girl try on costume, jewelry from the dress-up box. Michael was reading Where the Wild Things Are to a group of fascinated 6-year-olds. My uncle was explaining to a reporter how the center would benefit the local economy. My mother was showing visitors the photograph display that chronicled Nana's life. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like we were actually a family. Not because we were related by blood, but because we were all working towards something larger than ourselves. Because we were all honoring someone we had loved, each in our own imperfect way. The center has been open for 6 months now. We host art classes, poetry readings, community meetings, and birthday parties. Children come after school to do homework in the reading nook where Nana used to sit. Teenagers learn photography in the sunroom where she grew her orchids. Adults take painting classes in the dining room where we used to have Sunday dinners. I still live in my small apartment across town, but I spend most of my time at the center. I've never felt more at home anywhere. I've never felt more like myself. I've never felt more certain that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. My family has kept their commitments mostly. Sarah actually seems to enjoy working with the children, though she still posts selfies of herself wearing Nana's jewelry. Michael has become genuinely passionate about the library program and has expanded it beyond what I ever imagined. My uncle's business acumen has helped us secure grants and donations that keep the center thriving. My mother has become the keeper of family stories, not just Nana's but all of ours, weaving them together in ways that help visitors understand how art and family and memory intersect. We're not perfect. We still disagree about things. Sarah still makes subtle digs about my life choices. Michael still forgets to return my calls sometimes. My uncle still acts like he knows better than everyone else about financial matters. My mother still struggles to express affection in ways that don't feel conditional. But we're trying. And for the first time in my life, I feel like that's enough. Last week, a little girl came to one of our art classes and painted a picture of her family. When I asked her about it, she pointed to a figure standing slightly apart from the others. "That's my cousin," she said. "She's not really part of our family, but she comes to all our parties anyway." I looked at the painting, at the way the cousin was positioned at the edge but still clearly connected to the group, still obviously belonging despite being different. And I understood something fundamental about love and family, and the space between rejection and acceptance. "She sounds important," I told the little girl. "She is," the child replied seriously. "She's the one who remembers everyone's birthday." Sometimes the people who love us best are the ones who stand at the edges, watching and remembering and holding space for all of our imperfections. Sometimes the inheritance that matters most is not what we receive, but what we choose to preserve and pass on. They thought they had erased me from the family story. Instead, they gave me the opportunity to write the next chapter myself, one where love is measured not by what we take, but by what we give back.